Get that girl out before her poverty stains my marble. Celeste Ravello's voice cracked across the lobby of the Vireo building like a whip. Every step halted, every head turned. Nell Callahan, 18 years old, stood between two security men, rainwater dripping from a second-hand wool coat pinned shut with a safety pin onto the polished stone floor. She didn't struggle. She didn't beg. She simply spoke, every word clear. "Ma'am, this letter isn't addressed to you. My mother told me to place it in Mr. Corvino's hands. She's running out of time." Celeste snatched the envelope, let her eyes travel down to the girl's sneakers worn crooked at the heel, and laughed softly. "So sickness has finally taught people how to walk into this building. You bring one crumpled page here and imagine a man like him will adopt your suffering?" Then she tore the letter in half. The sound was small. The whole lobby heard it anyway. A yellowed Polaroid slipped from the envelope, turned once in the air, and landed at the shoe of a man who had just stepped out of the private elevator. Nobody breathed. Elias Corvino bent down and picked it up. In the photograph was his own face, 18 years younger, from a time before anyone called him a boss, his arm around a girl with auburn hair outside a bakery in Red Hook. On the back, in trembling ink, a single line: "Elias, the girl they are dragging out of your building is the child you were never allowed to know." Elias's expression did not change. He raised his head slowly and struck his onyx ring against the reception counter exactly twice. "Let her go." The two security men instantly backed off, their faces draining of color, bowing their heads in paralyzed silence. In Vireo Tower, a word from Celeste was an order, but a double tap of Corvino's onyx ring was absolute law. Disobeying it meant vanishing from Brooklyn before midnight. The smile died on Celeste's lips, because everyone in that building knew what those two knocks meant. And before October ended, 3 letters buried for 18 years, 1 lab result swapped during exactly 14 minutes of darkness, and a string of numbers that girl had copied into her battered notebook would tear apart everything that woman had protected at any cost. The person shouting loudest in that lobby was the one hiding the darkest secret of all. If you believe no human being should be judged by their clothes, their illness, or the money in their pocket, leave a like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe. The best part of this story is still ahead. Nell didn't look at Elias first. She lowered herself until both knees touched the cold stone floor, then picked up each half of the letter with both hands, the way someone might gather something fragile. The right half had absorbed the rainwater dripping from the hem of her coat, and the blue ink had begun to bleed at the bottom corner. She smoothed it carefully across her thigh, slowly, then folded the two halves together and slipped them into a pocket inside the black notebook whose spine had been repaired with tape. Only then did she stand. Danny Kovac had already released her and stepped back twice, his hands hanging at his sides as though he no longer knew where to put them. He was 24 years old, had worked there for only 7 months, and every morning before his shift, he bought a cup of coffee from the cart parked across the street. He had never seen the owner of this building from a distance of less than 15 meters. No one in the lobby moved. The woman at the reception desk kept one hand resting on the telephone receiver, neither setting it down nor lifting it. 2 men in suits who had been waiting for the elevator turned their backs and stared up at the ceiling, the deliberate retreat of men who understood they shouldn't be witnessing whatever was about to happen. Elias was still holding the photograph. He didn't look at it a second time. He looked at the girl. She wore an oversized men's wool coat with a broken zipper, fastened at the center of her chest with a safety pin. Her strawberry blonde hair was gathered with a rubber band. A red mark remained around her left wrist where Danny had gripped her. The girl stood with her back straight, both hands holding the notebook against her stomach, and she didn't blink. "What's your name?" He didn't ask it. He spoke the words like a line that needed to be filled in. She remained silent. It wasn't the silence of someone afraid, nor was it the silence of someone searching for a lie. It was a brief, measured pause, clean and deliberate. The pause of a person counting to 1 before speaking, making certain that whatever came out was exactly what she intended to say. Elias Corvino had used that same pause for 20 years in rooms where one careless word could cost a person everything. He recognized it before he had time to notice anything else about her. Before her face, before the words written on the back of the photograph. Nell Callahan. Celeste stepped half a pace forward, her voice turning smooth again, as though nothing had happened. "Darling, this is clearly a setup. They chose the very day you'd be in the lobby, the very moment it would be crowded. and brought along an old photograph that anyone in Red Hook could have picked out of some cardboard box. "Let me have security deal with this so you can get upstairs to your meeting on time." Elias didn't turn toward her. He gave no sign that he had heard a word. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on Nell's face, and his voice dropped another degree, low enough that those standing closest had to hold their breath to hear him. "Take her to the 40th floor." The woman at the reception desk set down the receiver. Danny swallowed hard and lifted a hand to point toward the guest elevators, then pulled it back again, because he was no longer certain he still had the right to give this girl directions. Nell didn't wait for anyone to lead her. Holding the notebook against her, she walked straight ahead, the unevenly worn heels of her sneakers leaving a long trail of water across the polished stone floor, all the way through the lobby and past the place where Celeste stood, and no one dared wipe it away. Celeste followed, her heels striking the floor faster than necessary. "I'm going up with you. Every guest who enters or leaves this building has to receive my security approval, even your guests." Elias pressed the button for the private elevator. He didn't look at her. He didn't forbid her from coming either. In 18 years beside that man, Celeste Ravello had learned that there were two kinds of silence. The first meant he was still considering. The second meant he had already decided, and was merely waiting for everyone else to step into the place he had chosen for them. The elevator doors closed on the three of them. She spent all 40 floors trying to determine which kind this was, and when the doors opened, she still didn't know. The small conference room on the 40th floor held 12 leather chairs and a walnut table as long as the entire room Nell and her mother had once rented in Gowanus. Someone pulled out a chair and invited her to sit. She didn't. She placed the black notebook on the table, removed the rubber band wrapped around it, and began arranging the documents by date, from left to right. Like someone who had performed this exact motion so many times she no longer needed to think about it. The first sheet was a birth certificate issued in Kings County on March 20th, 2008. Mother's name, Maren Callahan. The space for the father's name had been left blank, and that emptiness lay in the middle of the page like a hole torn through it. Next came 3 postal receipts, their edges yellowed with age, all 3 listing the sender as M. Callahan, and the delivery address as Corvino's former headquarters on Van Brunt Street in Red Hook. June 11th, July 29th, and September 18th, all in the year 2007. Then came a plastic hospital wristband that had been cut open, printed with Maren Callahan's name and an admission date from 4 weeks earlier. Then 3 appointment slips from St. Brigid Cancer Institute, 2 for dates already passed, and 1 for the day after tomorrow. When Nell had finished arranging everything, she stepped back half a pace and remained standing. Judith Ansell, the family's 61-year-old attorney, placed her phone face down on the table and asked whether Nell would permit her to take notes. Nell nodded. It was the first question anyone had asked her since she entered this building. Del Novak stood at the far end of the table without sitting, a marker tucked behind her ear, and she wasn't looking at the documents. She was watching the way the girl had arranged them. 47 years old, with 12 years spent as a forensic examiner for the police department before coming here, Del had sat across from every kind of person who ever brought evidence to a table. People inventing a story always put the strongest piece first. People telling the truth arrange things in order of time. Elias drew the first receipt toward him with the tips of 2 fingers. Who signed for these 3 letters? The question fell into the center of the room. Celeste lowered herself into the chair to his right, folded her arms on the table, and let out a very quiet laugh, the kind of laugh made by someone who thought this was becoming more ridiculous than it needed to be. Darling, that was 18 years ago. That office received no fewer than 30 letters a day, most of them job applications and bills. I was only 23 then. I signed for mail, deliveries, even the bread people brought to the office. Asking me who signed a receipt from 2007 is like asking me what I had for lunch that day. Nell didn't turn toward her. She spoke to the paper lying on the table. I'm not asking what you had for lunch. I'm asking why my mother sent 3 letters, 3 months in a row, with a receipt for every one of them, and never received a single reply. Celeste tilted her head. You could have mailed 3 letters to yourself and kept the receipts. Anyone could do that. Fine. Then open the correspondence log and compare them. If those 3 letters never arrived, my mother's name won't be there, and I'll walk out of here without anyone having to ask me. Celeste didn't answer at once. It was the first time that morning Celeste Ravello hadn't had a response already waiting in her mouth. Judith looked up from her notes. Del Novak removed the marker from behind her ear. Elias didn't look at either woman. He slid the receipt back into its original place among the documents, straight and precise, exactly where Nell had set it. Then, he looked up and spoke to Dell in the same tone he used when asking someone to bring him a cup of coffee. Sunset Park, the archives. Bring back every box from 2007. Not just the correspondence log. Every box in the entire row from that year. For the next 2 seconds, no one in the room looked at Celeste, so no one saw what happened. She remained seated with her back straight, her arms still folded on the table, not a single feature shifting on her face. Only the thumb of her right hand began turning the emerald ring on her ring finger, once, then again, as steadily as a clock running backward. Dell wrote 2 words in her notebook and walked toward the door. Celeste opened her mouth, and the words she intended to say were already poised at the tip of her tongue. Something about transportation costs, about the Sunset Park warehouse being in the middle of an inventory, about how this could surely wait until after the board meeting. But she said nothing, because any reason she gave to stop that row of boxes from leaving the warehouse, here and now, in this room, would be one reason too many. Elias turned back to the girl who was still standing. "What do you want from me?" Nell picked up the black notebook, held it against her stomach, and looked directly at him. "Nothing. I didn't come here to make you believe me. I came so you'd have no excuse to say you didn't know." Elias rose from his chair. It was the first time that morning he had changed position. "Where is your mother?" Nell didn't answer at once. She looked slowly around the room, as though she were allowing herself to see it for the first time. The walnut table, the 12 leather chairs, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking an entire borough, the woman dressed in white waiting outside in the hallway to clear away the cups. Then she looked at Celeste, who still sat motionless with one finger resting on her emerald ring, before turning back to Elias. "I deliver letters. I don't deliver addresses." Judith stopped writing. Elias didn't move. "What do you think I would do with that address?" "I don't know." "That's exactly the problem." She didn't raise her voice or speak defiantly. She said it in the same tone someone might use to read a line from a bill. 40 minutes ago, I was standing in the lobby of your building, and someone ordered that I be dragged outside before my poverty stained the stone floor. The woman who gave that order is still sitting in this room, 1 chair away from you, and no one has asked her to leave. My mother weighs 47 kilograms. She can't get out of bed without someone helping her. You want me to write down an address and hand it over to this room?" No one spoke. Nell gathered her notebook, leaving every document on the table, arranged in its original order, without a single page missing. "Keep all of it. The originals, not copies. Examine them for as long as you want. Call anyone you want. There's only one thing I'm taking with me." She opened the inner pocket of the notebook, and for 2 seconds, the 2 halves of the letter appeared before disappearing again. "My mother wrote this. It isn't anyone's evidence." Then she walked toward the door. No one stopped her. Danny Kovac stood outside in the hallway, close against the wall, and when she passed him, he stepped back half a pace to make room for her, a gesture that wouldn't have occurred to him 7 minutes earlier. The elevator doors closed. Inside the room, Celeste released a very faint breath, her shoulders dropping perhaps a centimeter, and she had barely managed the first 3 words of, "I told you," when Elias turned to Dell. "Follow her." Dell didn't move. "Do you want me to tail the girl, or do you want me to find her mother?" "Find her. Then let her go." Following someone who's already frightened leads to only one place, and it's usually the wrong one. She took out her marker, added another line to her notebook, then walked out. Elias remained alone with the table, and 15 sheets of paper arranged by date. He didn't touch them. He stood looking down at the city through the glass, and a thought entered his mind, one he didn't want to consider but couldn't drive away. In 20 years, how many people had been found for him? People hiding from debts, people stealing portions of shipments at the harbor, people falsifying a number in a contract. Give Del Novak a name, and within a day, a file would appear on his desk, where they lived, where they worked, their schedules, who their relatives were, and where they could be found when they didn't want to be found. Now he had given her one more name, and that name belonged to his daughter. It took Del 4 hours. She didn't begin with residential records, because people without homes didn't appear in residential records. She began with the place where an 18-year-old with no address still had to appear every day if she wanted money for food. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Del was standing in the basement of the J Street subway station, in front of a concrete pillar with peeling paint, where an old electronic keyboard leaned against its base. A sheet of nylon had been spread across the top and secured with rubber bands, and 2 white keys near the middle had yellowed and sunk from being pressed too many times. No one was beside it. The sandwich vendor at the stall across the way told her to leave it alone because no one would take it. Everyone in the station knew the keyboard belonged to the girl. He said she stood there every morning, from around 7 until nearly 10, and always played only about 4 songs. There was one she played more than all the others. That slow one. The one where she always stumbled when she reached the middle. She stumbled at the exact same place every time, paused for a beat, then continued as though nothing had happened. Dell asked when he had last seen the girl. He said that morning. She had been in the middle of playing when her phone rang. She listened for less than 10 seconds before hanging up, closed the keyboard cover, propped it against the pillar, then ran. He pointed toward the stairs leading northeast, where, 3 blocks away, stood a 4-story red brick building with a sign that read, St. Bridget Cancer Institute. At 2:37 the following afternoon, Elias Corvino entered the observation unit of the emergency department at St. Bridget Cancer Institute alone. He had told his driver to park a block away and ordered Dell to remain in the car, and both were things he hadn't done in years. The observation unit had 6 beds, separated by blue fabric curtains, the smell of rubbing alcohol mingling with cold coffee from the machine at the end of the hallway, while some kind of monitor beeped steadily behind the second curtain. Bed number 4 was beside the window. He recognized her before he had time to prepare himself for recognizing her. Maren Callahan, 38 years old, lay on her side with a thin blanket pulled up to her chest and an intravenous line running into the back of her left hand, secured with 3 layers of paper tape. Her hair was tied beneath a square gray scarf, and what little showed at her temples was so thin that he could see her scalp. Her cheekbones protruded. Her wrists were as slender as a child's, but when she opened her eyes and saw him, she didn't flinch, didn't sit up, didn't ask who had told him she was there, and didn't ask what he had come for. She merely looked at him for about 3 seconds, from his shoes to his face, exactly the way someone might inspect an item ordered long ago that had finally been delivered. "You're 18 years late." There wasn't an empty chair in the room. The only plastic chair beside the bed had an oversized men's wool coat draped over its back and a backpack resting beneath it, and no one told him he could move them and sit down. Elias remained standing, his arms at his sides. For 18 years, he had walked into rooms where everyone rose when he entered, rooms where chairs were pulled out before he had time to look for one, rooms where he decided how long the silence would last. Here, the woman lying in the bed decided the length of the silence, and she stretched it another 4 beats before speaking again. "You won't need to stand there long. I'm tired, and I can't say much." He searched for something to say and couldn't find anything that fit. Every sentence that rose to his throat belonged to a man conducting a negotiation. "I didn't know about the 3 letters." Maren closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her voice remained even and courteous, still the voice of someone speaking to the representative of another party, rather than the man whose face had been in the photograph she'd kept for 18 years. "I didn't ask you here so you could explain. Believe whatever you want. It doesn't change anything for me anymore. I told the girl to deliver the letter for another reason." She lifted the hand without the intravenous line about 2 inches, then lowered it again because raising it any higher exhausted her. She dropped out of school in the 11th grade. She was 16 then. She works nights at a warehouse over in Maspeth, plays music at the subway station in the morning, and spends the afternoon sitting in this hallway. For 3 years, she hasn't slept more than 4 hours a night. "I'm not asking you for a single cent for myself. Do you understand me? Not 1 cent. I only need one person to know she exists, so that if next month, or the month after that, I can no longer sit up, there will be at least one name in this world for people to call, and that name won't be the telephone number of a social services office." Elias didn't answer. From the hallway came the rattle of a cart passing by, the sound of a nurse calling someone's name, and the elevator doors opening and closing. He had sat at the head of negotiating tables where a reply delayed by half a second was considered a concession. Yet here he allowed 9 full seconds to pass without finding a single word. "What do you need?" "I just told you. I'm asking what you need. And I just answered you." She said it very softly, almost kindly. "You still think that question can have only one kind of answer, don't you?" The curtain was pulled sharply aside. Nell stood there with a paper cup of water still in one hand, her hair disheveled, the dark circles beneath her eyes so deep they looked as though someone had rubbed ash into her skin. In the half-second it took her to look from her mother to the man standing beside the bed, she understood everything. She placed the cup on the bedside table, walked around the foot of the bed, and stepped between them, her back to her mother and her face turned toward him. She wasn't as tall as he was. She didn't need to be. Who told you about this place? It wasn't your mother. I know. I asked who. Elias looked at the girl standing between him and her mother's hospital bed, her arms at her sides, both feet planted firmly, refusing to retreat even an inch. He had seen that stance many times in his life, worn by men guarding warehouse doors at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he had never imagined that one day he would see it in someone who carried half his blood. Dr. Samuel Reyes came in at 3:15, 58 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and glasses attached to a string of colorful plastic beads that some young patient had braided for him. He looked for exactly 2 seconds at the man in the three-piece suit standing beside bed number 4, then turned to Marin and asked whether she wanted him to remain in the room while they talked. He didn't ask Elias. He asked Marin. She nodded. Reyes pulled out the only plastic chair, sat down at eye level with his patient, opened the file across his lap, and began speaking in the voice of a man who had delivered these words so many times that he no longer used a single unnecessary one. Marin had acute myeloid leukemia. It wasn't the kind that could wait. The first treatment protocol was called induction chemotherapy. It would last about 4 weeks, and the goal was to push the disease below detectable levels. He didn't use the word cure. He explained that the most dangerous period wasn't during the infusion, but in the 2 weeks afterward, when her white blood cell count would fall to its lowest point and her body would be left with almost no defenses, when a mild fever that an ordinary person could overcome with 2 pills would be reason enough for his patients to call emergency services in the middle of the night. He said that even if the disease went into remission, the possibility of its return was very real for someone in Marin's risk group, and the next step would usually be a stem cell transplant. A transplant means we have to find a donor whose HLA markers are compatible with yours, Reyes said, his eyes still on Marin and no one else in the room. The best chance always comes from someone who shares the patient's bloodline. Siblings first, then children or parents. An unrelated donor can also be a match, but the odds are much lower, and no one can promise how long the wait for a registry match will be. Marin gave a faint nod. Nell stood at the foot of the bed, and Elias watched her open the black notebook and write down every word, including the phrase, shares the patient's bloodline, even underlining HLA. Elias asked about the cost. Reyes answered without hesitation. He gave him the amount for the induction treatment alone, the amount for the monitoring period, and the estimated amount if a transplant became necessary. He added that Marin's current insurance would cover only part of it because she had lost her job and, with it, her employer provided coverage in April. I'll pay for everything, Elias said, starting today, including anything else that comes up. Reyes closed the file and looked up. It was the first time he had looked directly at the other man. Money removes a few barriers, sir. It doesn't replace consent. This is my patient's body. She decides whether to receive treatment, how far that treatment goes, when it stops, and who is allowed in the room when I read her results. If you pay, I'll make a note that you paid. Nothing more. If you don't agree with that arrangement, you're welcome to keep your money. Somewhere beyond the second curtain, a monitor continued its steady beeping. Elias looked at the silver-haired doctor wearing glasses attached to a string of childish plastic beads, and what silenced him wasn't the statement itself, but the fact that the man had made it without once considering whom he was speaking to. I agree, he said. Judith Ansell arrived at 4:10 with her laptop and drafted the agreement on the bedside table. 5 pages. The essential terms appeared on the first page and were repeated on the last. The payments created no rights whatsoever over Marin Callahan, Nell Callahan, or any medical decisions. They carried no conditions concerning where either of them lived, the disclosure of information, or any personal relationship, and the recipient could terminate the arrangement at any time without being required to repay anything. Marin read all 5 pages. She read slowly, stopping twice when her eyes grew tired, and Nell didn't rush her. On the 3rd page, she requested 2 changes. First, she wanted the provision allowing the paying party to receive progress reports from the hospital removed, because her medical record wasn't a weekly update for anyone. Second, she wanted a sentence added stating that if the paying party stopped making payments, that decision would create no obligation whatsoever for her daughter. Judith looked up at Elias. He didn't question a single word. Change it. Marin lifted her eyes from the document and looked at him. This time, she held his gaze for longer than 3 seconds. Much longer. Then she picked up the pen and signed, her signature trembling on the final stroke, before pushing the papers aside. Elias straightened, and his voice returned to its natural register, lower than every other voice in the room. "There's one more thing. I want a paternity test." Nell closed the notebook. Marin didn't object. Reyes said only that if they were going to do it, it had to be done properly, with verified identities, sealed samples, and a complete chain of custody. Elias tapped his onyx ring twice against the bedside table, and in the hallway, Celeste Ravello rose from the row of waiting room chairs where she had been sitting for 2 hours without anyone inviting her inside. She stepped to the doorway and spoke in the gentlest voice she had managed all day. "Then we should choose somewhere discreet, darling. Not a public hospital, not through insurance, and nothing that leaves a trace in the system. I know a place that does very clean work and never lets a word slip. Ashgrove Genomics." At 4:12 that afternoon, Celeste Ravello pushed open the emergency exit door at the end of the second-floor corridor of St. Bridget Cancer Institute and stepped into the concrete stairwell. It smelled of fire-resistant paint, a light flickered on the landing below, and there were no cameras. She had confirmed that within the first 10 minutes of setting foot in the hospital, she made the call from her second phone, a black device with no photographs, no contact list, and only 4 numbers saved in its memory. Warren Pike answered on the second ring. "Miss Ravello, it's been a long time since I heard from you. Tomorrow or the day after, someone from Corvino will contact you to arrange a paternity test. 2 samples, one from a man and one from an 18-year-old girl." There was a rustle of paper at the other end of the line, followed by the creak of a swivel chair. "That's excellent. We do that kind of work all the time. The result mustn't confirm anything. Do you understand me?" The chair stopped moving. For 7 seconds, neither of them spoke. And during those 7 seconds, Celeste didn't repeat the question, breathe more heavily, or shift her position. She stood with her back against the iron railing, one hand tucked into the pocket of her coat, her thumb turning the emerald ring at a steady rhythm, like a clock running backward. "You're asking me to falsify the result of a paternity test," Pike said. His voice had dropped half an octave. "I'm telling you that if the result confirms anything, then within a month, lawyers will reopen every old Corvino file to establish identity, inheritance, and a dozen other things. And when lawyers open the files, they don't open a single page. They open an entire year. I have nothing to do with your files. You have nothing to do with any files, Warren. You're connected only to the $23,000 in tax money that mysteriously vanished from your balance sheet last year, and to the person who made it disappear." The other end of the line fell silent a second time, longer than before. Below her, on the first-floor landing, a door opened and closed. 2 nurses passed by, talking about the night shift, and then the stairwell went quiet again. Celeste waited until they were gone before continuing, and her voice remained unchanged, even and gentle. The voice of a mother reminding her daughter to put on another layer. "This afternoon, he sent someone to the Sunset Park warehouse, not to retrieve one ledger. He ordered them to bring back the entire row of boxes from 2007. Tomorrow, they'll be spread across the floor of the 40th floor, and someone will open every box, and inside one of them is a number no one has had any reason to look at for 18 years. Now they have a reason. That reason is lying in bed number 4 in the hematology ward, and she weighs 47 kilograms. Miss Ravello, you don't have to do anything if you find it difficult," she said. "Accept the job, follow the proper procedure, and send out the result. Then you and I can wait together and see who is still sitting in their place at the beginning of next month." "I can wait. I'm simply not sure you can." She ended the call before he had a chance to answer. That was what she always did. The person who hung up first wasn't the one begging for a favor. Celeste removed the battery from the phone, slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat, adjusted her collar in the frosted glass of the emergency exit door, and when she stepped back into the brightly lit corridor, her face had returned to exactly what it had been when she entered. Calm, composed, and just sufficiently weary. The face of a woman who had spent 2 hours sitting outside a hospital room because she was worried about her fiancé. For the next 5 days, Elias Corvino didn't cancel a single meeting, leave a single document unsigned, or tell anyone in Vireo Tower what was happening at St. Bridget Cancer Institute. But he developed a new habit, one he hadn't yet named, even to himself. Every evening at around 7 o'clock, he would turn his phone over and check whether there was a message from a number belonging to a phone with a cracked screen, and there never was. On the third day, he did what a man like him always did when he wanted to show that he cared. He paid for the most expensive thing he could find. He arranged for a restaurant in Tribeca to deliver 2 meals a day directly to the hematology ward, with someone carrying wooden boxes, cloth napkins, and even a card printed with raised lettering. On the 4th day, the service informed him that the order had been cancelled. He called Nell. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "You cancelled the order." "Yes." "Why?" "Because my mother can't eat it, sir." Water was running at the other end of the line. He heard her turn off the faucet, then walk somewhere quieter. "Chemotherapy ruins your sense of taste. Meat tastes like metal to my mother now. Even plain water tastes like metal. Anything even slightly salty makes her nauseous. You sent her a steak that cost as much as 3 days of anti-nausea medication, and she forced herself to swallow 2 bites, so the man carrying the wooden box wouldn't have to go back and report that she hadn't touched it. Yesterday she threw it all up in the bathroom and didn't tell me. I found out because I saw her hiding the towel." Elias said nothing. "If you want to help, ask Dr. Reyes what she needs. Or ask me. For the past 3 days, the only things she's been able to keep down are thin oatmeal and cold apple juice. They sell those at the corner store for $1.29 a carton. You could have told me from the beginning. It isn't my responsibility to teach you how to care for someone who's sick." "No, but you could have told me. And you could have asked." She answered so quickly that he understood those words had been waiting inside her for a long time, needing only someone to lift the lid. "You don't ask. You place orders. You do that with everyone, and it works with everyone because they need your money. My mother doesn't. She only needs to swallow something and keep it in her stomach until the next morning." "Then I'm asking you now." "Yes. What do you need?" There was a long silence at the other end of the line. "You just asked the wrong person," she said, and hung up. On the afternoon of the 5th day, he came carrying 2 boxes of oatmeal and 4 bottles of apple juice from the corner store in a plastic bag, and he walked through the hematology ward with that plastic bag in his hand like a man carrying something he didn't know how to hold properly. Nell hadn't returned from her night shift yet. Marin was sitting propped against her pillows, the blanket pulled up to her waist, and she looked at the plastic bag, then at him, with something in the corners of her eyes that came very close to amusement. "She scolded you." "Yes. She's like you that way. She doesn't scold anyone twice. The second time, she simply stops altogether and says nothing more." He placed the bag on the bedside table, and because there still wasn't an empty chair in the room, he remained standing. Darkness had fallen outside the window, and the hallway light cast a long streak across the floor. "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "June, July, September." He spoke the names of the 3 months as though he were reading 3 numbers from an official report. And then nothing. "Why didn't you send a 4th letter?" Marin looked down at the hand wrapped in paper tape for a long while. "Because by October, I understood that if the first 3 letters received no answer, the 4th wouldn't either. And because I was close to giving birth by then, I needed to save my strength for something else." She paused. "But that wasn't the main reason." "What was the main reason?" She raised her eyes and looked at him, and Elias suddenly realized that he didn't want to hear the answer. That of all the rooms he had ever entered, this was the first in which he was afraid of a single sentence. "Are you sure you want to hear it?" He stood there for another 3 seconds or so, one hand still resting on the handle of the plastic bag. Then he said it was late, that he would return tomorrow, and he walked out of the room without asking a second time. At 9:40 on Wednesday morning, Warren Pike arrived at the hospital room carrying an aluminum case and accompanied by a young technician whose name he didn't introduce. He was 53 years old, with soft hands and a pocket square printed with tiny flowers, and he smiled before he finished his sentences, the kind of smile worn by a man accustomed to working in rooms where everything had already been arranged. Elias stood beside the window. Judith Ansell sat at the corner of the table with her computer open and ready. Dr. Reyes had surgery scheduled, so he stopped by for only 3 minutes, repeated that he wanted to see the identity verification record, and left. Nell didn't sit down. She stood at the head of the table with her black notebook open before her and a ballpoint pen held between 2 fingers, watching the aluminum case from the moment it was set down until the moment it was opened. The technician removed 2 buccal swab kits, 2 plastic tubes with red caps, a sheet of labels, and a marker. The labels were handwritten. Nell noticed that and immediately wrote the first line in her notebook. Labels handwritten, no printed barcode. Elias's sample was collected first. He sat on the edge of the chair, opened his mouth, and the technician rubbed the swab against the inside of his left cheek for 30 seconds, placed it in the tube, and tightened the cap. Pike used the marker to write the code A-2214 on the label, then pressed it onto the side of the tube. Nell raised her phone with its cracked screen and took a photograph, then wrote in her notebook. First tube, 947, code A-2214, sample from Elias Corvino. Then it was her turn. She put down her pen, opened her mouth, remained still for 30 seconds, and picked the pen up again before the swab had even been placed in the tube. Pike wrote, A-2215. She took another photograph and recorded, second tube, 951, code A-2215, sample from Nell Callahan. Then she pushed the notebook across the table toward Pike and placed the ballpoint pen on top of it. Please sign here for me. Pike looked at the black graph paper notebook with tape holding its spine together, its pages curled at the edges, and its blue ink handwriting filling line after line with dates from the beginning of the book onward. He smiled before finishing his sentence. You're being overly cautious. We have complete documentation, the technician's signature, and internal identification codes. You don't need a schoolgirl's notebook, young lady. Maybe I don't, but I still want you to sign it. In a notebook, yes. She neither pushed the notebook any closer nor drew it back. She left it lying in the middle of the table and said nothing more for 6 full seconds. And 6 seconds of silence in a room with 4 people was a very long time. Judith stopped typing. The young technician lowered her eyes to the aluminum case. Pike glanced toward Elias, waiting for him to say something like that was enough, or that she was young, or that they still had a great deal to do. But Elias said nothing. He remained where he was beside the window and watched. Just sign it, Nell said. If nothing is wrong, your signature won't hurt anyone. Warren Pike picked up the ballpoint pen. Later, when people asked him why he had signed, he couldn't answer, because the real reason was too small to admit before a hearing panel. He had signed because 4 people in that room were watching him, and because refusing to sign a schoolgirl's notebook in front of an 18-year-old girl would have made him look exactly like a man with something to hide. He wrote his name beneath the 2 identification codes, added the date out of professional habit, pushed the notebook back to her, and smiled once more. Nell closed the notebook, wrapped the elastic band around it, slipped it into her backpack, and pulled the zipper shut. At that exact moment, Elias's phone vibrated. A company car had arrived downstairs to deliver a set of documents requiring his urgent signature for the Pier 7 contract, and he needed to go down and sign them in person because the other party was waiting to board a flight. He stepped into the hallway. He was gone for 90 seconds. During those 90 seconds, the young technician turned her back to retrieve the identity verification form from the case. Pike placed the 2 sample tubes inside a clear plastic evidence bag, peeled away the protective strip along the edge, pressed his finger firmly along the seal, and placed the bag in the inner compartment of the case. No one was asked to sign across the sealed edge. No one photographed the bag after it had been sealed. Judith looked up and asked about the chain of custody form, the one recording the time of every transfer and bearing the signature of each person who handled the sample package. Pike nodded at once, still smiling, and said that his laboratory had digitized the entire process and that he would have the document emailed that afternoon. Elias returned to the room at 9:56. The aluminum case was already closed. Pike shook his hand, said the results would be ready within 48 hours, and walked out the door. Inside the girl's backpack, the black notebook lay motionless in the middle compartment, and on its 29th page were 2 identification codes written in blue ballpoint ink with the signature of the very man who had just left the room beneath them. Later, when people reconstructed what had happened that morning, they did it through timestamps rather than testimony, and the timestamps told the story this way. At 10:38, the Ashgrove Genomics vehicle left the parking area of St. Bridget Cancer Institute. At 11:19, Ashgrove's internal system recorded a maintenance request submitted from an administrator account under the name W. Pike, reporting a network switch failure in the ground floor sample storage area and marking the request as high priority. At 11:22, The video feed from the camera mounted above the sample storage room door stopped recording. At 11:26, an access card bearing the name W. Pike was swiped at the sample storage room door. Inside the room stood a steel work table, a freezer kept at -20 degrees, a label printer, and a drawer containing sealing supplies. The aluminum case was placed on the table. The clear sealed plastic bag was sliced open along its lower edge with a utility knife, avoiding the area with the seal because the seal was what people looked at. 2 red-capped plastic tubes were removed. The tube labeled A-2214 was set down on the left. From the second compartment of the freezer, another red-capped plastic tube was taken out. It belonged to a stored sample set from a male client, whose file had been closed in June, and who had no blood relation to anyone involved in the case. The old label was peeled from that tube. The label printer wasn't used. A blank label of the same kind was taken from the stack inside the case, and the code A-2214 was written on it in marker, in the same color ink and the same handwriting, by the same person who had written it at 9:47 that morning. The tube containing Elias Corvino's sample was dropped into a yellow biohazard waste bag in the corner of the room. The replacement tube was placed inside the plastic bag with the tube labeled A-2215. A roll of security seals from the same batch as the roll used that morning was taken from the supply drawer. A new seal was placed over the cut. The bag was turned over so that the side bearing the original seal faced upward. The entire procedure took less than 4 minutes. At 11:36, the sample bag was placed in the receiving compartment and entered into that day's sample log. 2 samples: paternity test, priority status, results within 48 hours. At 11:39, the video feed from the camera above the sample storage room door resumed. The period without footage lasted 14 minutes. At 11:44, a wire transfer of $214,000 was made from Celeste Ravello's personal account to the account of a limited liability company registered in Delaware, whose representative was a former classmate of Warren Pike. The purpose of the transfer was recorded in 4 words: Strategic Data Review. No one in the Ashgrove Genomics building asked why the network switch had failed for exactly 14 minutes and then repaired itself. No maintenance technician came to the building that day. The maintenance request was marked as resolved at 12:02, also from the account under the name W. Pike. At 3:31 on Friday afternoon, the encrypted file from Ashgrove Genomics arrived in Elias Corvino's inbox, and he opened it at once at his desk on the 40th floor. The conclusion appeared on the 3rd line, in bold, and consisted of exactly 1 sentence. The tested man was excluded as the biological father of the tested woman. Probability of paternity, 0%. Judith Ansell stood beside the door. Del Novak sat in the chair to the left, and Celeste sat across from Elias with her hands folded one over the other on the tabletop. Elias read the document once, then he read it again, more slowly, starting from the first line. No one heard him breathe. He didn't strike the table. He didn't stand up. He didn't say a single word for 40 seconds. And then he picked up the paper with both hands, folded it in half, ran his thumb firmly along the crease until it lay perfectly flat, folded it once more into a small rectangle, pressed the second crease flat, and slipped it into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. The entire motion took about 6 seconds. Del Novak watched him do it, and she later said that she had worked for him for 9 years, but had never seen anything that chilled her blood the way those 6 seconds did. Because in those 6 seconds, someone had just been put away from his life, neatly, smoothly, and precisely along the fold. Judith stepped forward half a pace. "Sir, I still haven't received the chain of custody record for the samples. They promised to send it on Wednesday, and it still hasn't arrived. Before you do anything, I recommend that we request the complete records and—" "There's no need." Celeste said nothing. She merely closed her hands together and lowered her head at exactly the right angle and exactly the right moment, just enough to look like someone sharing his pain rather than someone waiting. Elias rose, picked up his coat, and went down to the car. He didn't go to the hospital. He had the driver take him to the warehouse in Maspeth, where the night shift began at 4 in the afternoon, and he stood in the parking lot outside the chain-link fence until Nell came through the employee entrance at 4:20, wearing an orange reflective vest borrowed from the warehouse, her hair tied back, and her backpack hanging from one shoulder. She saw the car, she saw him, and she stopped 3 meters away without coming any closer, because there was something on his face that she had seen many times before in her life, on shift supervisors, on the people behind welfare counters, on those about to say something to her that they had already decided long before she arrived. "The results came back," he said. "Yes. 0%. She said nothing, nor did she ask to see the document. She simply stood there, and the fact that she didn't ask sent the blood rushing to both his temples, because in 20 years of sitting at the head of negotiating tables, he had learned that innocent people cried out, while prepared people remained silent. The part where you canceled the meal order and scolded me over the phone because of a piece of steak, forcing me to buy $1.29 worth of oatmeal myself and feel like a fool. Even the fact that you never cried, not once. I've met many people who came to ask me for one thing or another, and every one of them cried. But you didn't. Who taught you?" Nell didn't step back. She adjusted the strap of her backpack on her shoulder. "Hunger did." "That's a good answer." "It isn't a good answer. It's the true one." She spoke in the same even voice she used when reading vital signs to a nurse at 3 in the morning. "When I was 15, I cried in the human resources office of a supermarket because they had docked my mother's pay. They called security. When I was 16, I cried in the school office while asking to defer my enrollment. They handed me a pamphlet. When I was 17, I cried in the county hospital emergency room at 4 in the morning, and they told me to go outside so I wouldn't disturb the other patients. Those 3 times taught me one thing: crying doesn't change anything, and it gives people an excuse not to listen to what you're saying. So I stopped. Did you think I'd been saving my tears to use on you?" A forklift horn sounded inside the warehouse. Someone called out another person's name. Elias stood motionless. "I want to see the document," she said. He didn't reach into his breast pocket. He looked at her for another 2 seconds, then turned away and opened the car door. The last words he spoke before getting inside were almost exactly the same words he had said to someone else 18 years earlier, though he didn't realize it. "There's no need anymore." At 8:15 on Saturday morning, Elias Corvino entered room 4 in the hematology ward of St. Bridget Cancer Institute, with a sheet of paper folded into quarters in his breast pocket. This time, he wasn't alone. Judith Ansell walked half a step behind him, and on the way from the parking lot to the second floor, she had said 3 times that this should be delivered in writing, and all 3 times he hadn't answered. Marin was sitting propped against her pillows. It was the 9th day after her infusion. Her white blood cell count was at its lowest point, and a small plastic basin sat within reach on the bedside table. Nell wasn't there. She was downstairs collecting her mother's medication. Elias didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of the bed and spoke in the same voice he used when reading the terms of a contract termination. Clear, neither fast nor slow, without a single unnecessary word. The treatment that had already been approved and paid for would remain in place through the end of the induction regimen. He wouldn't withdraw a single cent from that portion because he had signed for it, and he wasn't the kind of man who signed something and then took it back. Everything else would end within 48 hours. The funding for the next phase, the application to transfer her to a private inpatient unit, the transportation, and every commitment that hadn't yet been put in writing. The other side had 48 hours to make alternative arrangements. Marin listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him once. When he finished, she reached up and pulled the blanket a little higher, then asked him a single question, though it wasn't the one he had expected. "Did you ever hold the tube in your own hand?" "What?" "From the moment they swabbed your cheek until the moment the result arrived on your computer? Was there ever a time when you held that tube in your hand?" He didn't answer. "No," she answered for him. The girl photographed the tube. She wrote the code in her notebook. She made them sign it. "And you went downstairs to sign a peer contract while the case was being closed. You accepted a sheet of paper from the man your fiancé introduced to you, and you brought that paper here, stood at the foot of my bed, and read it aloud as if you were reading a sentence." She stopped because she was short of breath, and it took 2 breaths before she could continue. "Science doesn't collect samples, Elias. People do." Elias looked down at the woman weighing 47 kilograms who lay before him, and for 3 seconds, he almost reached into his breast pocket. But he didn't, because if he took out the paper, he would have to read it for a 3rd time, and he knew he couldn't bear for it to say, on that 3rd reading, the same thing it had said on the first 2. 48 hours, he said. "I heard you. You've said that 3 times already. You don't need to say it a 4th. He turned toward the door. Dr. Samuel Reyes stood in the doorway, still holding the chart for bed 2. and no one knew how long he had been standing there. He didn't move aside at once. "You could have sent that message through your attorney on Monday morning," Reyes said. "Mrs. Ansel is standing right behind you. One email from her would have done it. My patient is on the 9th day after her infusion. Her neutrophil count is nearly 0, and anything that raises her heart rate over the next 2 weeks is something I'll have to enter into her medical record. I have the right to tell her in person." "You do. I didn't say you didn't." Reyes stepped aside to let him pass, then delivered his next words without raising his voice. "I'm only saying that you chose to say it here, this morning, standing at the foot of her bed, instead of sending an email on Monday. And I've been doing this work for 30 years, sir. People choose this way only when they need to win something that very morning." Elias walked past him without answering. At the end of the corridor, he passed Nell as she stepped out of the elevator carrying a bag of medication. She stopped. He didn't. Neither of them said a word, and she stood there watching his back until the doors to the treatment ward closed behind him. Then she continued toward room 4, and when she entered and saw her mother staring out the window, she understood at once what had happened without needing to ask. 4 hours later, at exactly noon on Saturday, a New York tabloid published a 900-word article with a headline claiming that one of Brooklyn's most powerful men had nearly been deceived by a young woman pretending to be his illegitimate daughter. It included a blurred photograph of the girl entering the lobby of Vireo Tower in the rain, the initials of a cancer hospital in Brooklyn, and a line asserting that the paternity test had returned a result of 0%. The article was published at exactly noon. The results file had left Ashgrove Genomics server at 3:31 the previous afternoon, and the first person in the world authorized to open it was Elias Corvino at 3:31 on Friday afternoon. Later, when Del Novak reconstructed the timeline, she circled a gap and wrote 3 words beside it. 9 minutes. Nell didn't wait for the full 48 hours. She finished everything in 4. At 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, she went up to the family accommodation room that Elias's office had rented on the top floor of the building across from the hospital, the room where mother and daughter had stayed for only 11 nights, and the first 11 nights in 3 years that they had slept in beds with sheets. She packed her clothes back into her old backpack, folded the blankets, smoothed the bedsheets, and wiped down the small table with a paper towel. In the kitchenette cabinet were 14 boxes of oatmeal, 9 bottles of apple juice, a case of electrolyte water, and 2 cartons of nutritional supplements formulated for patients undergoing treatment, all still factory sealed. She set aside 3 boxes of oatmeal and 2 bottles of apple juice, exactly what had already been opened, exactly what her mother had eaten. She put everything that remained unopened into 2 cloth bags, carried them down to the ground floor, and placed them on the desk in the hospital's social services office. The woman on duty asked whose name she should record as the donor. Nell told her there was no need to write down anyone's name. She only needed to distribute the supplies among the inpatients who had no family bringing them anything. Then Nell went back upstairs, placed the 2 keys on the small table, and set the signed 5-page contract beside them, perfectly neat, with every page intact, no added notes, and not a single line crossed out. She picked up the new phone the office had given her the week before, so they could reach her more easily, turned it on one last time, and composed a message to Elias Corvino's number. The message didn't contain a single word of accusation. It didn't contain the word you, the word I, or any word that didn't need to be there. It read as follows: "Your sample tube bears the code A-2214. It was labeled at 9:47 on Wednesday morning, and a photograph exists. My tube bears the code A-2215. It was labeled at 9:51, and a photograph exists. The person who wrote the labels signed to confirm both identification codes. Between 9:54 and 9:56, no one signed across the seal, and no one photographed the sample package. The chain of custody record was promised by Wednesday afternoon and still hasn't been provided. I have submitted a written request for that record. I won't make contact again unless evidence makes contact necessary." She sent the message, turned off the phone, removed the SIM card, and placed both the phone and the card on top of the contract. Then she took her old phone from the outer pocket of her backpack, its cracked screen held together with clear tape, plugged it into a borrowed charger at an outlet in the hallway for 15 minutes until it had enough power, and switched it on. At 7 o'clock that evening, mother and daughter returned to the shelter on Atlantic Avenue, where they had lived for 14 months before getting that room, where each room held 4 bunk beds and 1 personal locker, and where the hallway lights never went out. The night manager recognized Marin, asked no questions, and assigned them 2 adjoining lower bunks in the corner near the window. At 3:12 on Sunday morning, Nell woke because the rhythm of her mother's breathing had changed. She put a hand to Marin's forehead, then took the thermometer from her backpack, and the number on the display was 39.2 degrees Celsius. She didn't wake anyone else in the room. She opened the black notebook to the page she was using, called Emergency Services. And when the dispatcher answered, she read slowly and clearly, in the exact order she had been recording it for the past 3 years. Female patient, 38 years old. Acute myeloid leukemia. Day 10 after induction chemotherapy. Temperature 39.2 degrees, measured at 3:12. Most recent neutrophil count taken 2 days ago, below 500. Currently taking anti-nausea medication and prophylactic antifungal medication. And she read out the name and dosage of each one. Under the care of St. Bridget Cancer Institute. Attending physician Samuel Reyes, Hematology Department. History of 1 episode of neutropenic fever 16 days ago. No known drug allergies. Address is the shelter at 42 Atlantic Avenue. Room 3. Lower bunk in the inside corner. The main entrance requires a code. She would come downstairs to open it. The ambulance arrived 19 minutes later. As the paramedic attached the monitoring leads to Marin, he listened to Nell repeat the neutrophil count for the second time, then looked up at the 18-year-old girl standing there in her nightclothes with a man's wool coat hastily fastened with a safety pin over them, and asked if she was a nurse. "I'm her daughter." Delnovak didn't wait for anyone to assign her a task. On Monday morning, she began where every investigation should begin, with the question of who knew first. The article went live at noon on Saturday. The newsroom had received an anonymous email with an attachment at 3:22 on Friday afternoon, sent from a disposable address, registered 40 minutes earlier. The official report reached Elias Corvino's inbox at 3:31. The attachment sent to the newsroom contained metadata that hadn't been erased, and it showed that the file had been exported at 3:22 on Friday afternoon from a laptop registered in the corporation's internal system as the chief financial officer's second device. Dell printed that line, underlined it with a marker, and wrote beside it, 9 minutes earlier. The second thing she did was open the corporation's list of approved medical and forensic service providers. 311 organizations in all, last updated in April. Ashgrove Genomics wasn't on it. The third thing was the chain of custody record for the samples. After 4 phone calls and a formal written request, signed by Judith Ansell, Warren Pike sent back an 11-line explanation, stating that the handwritten sequence of numbers recorded at the collection site had been a temporary code, and that it had been converted into an internal receiving code during intake. The recorded time of that conversion was 10:52 on Wednesday morning. Dell read that line 3 times. Then, she opened the folder of photographs Judith had uploaded on the day the samples were collected, scrolled down, and stopped at the last image. Warren Pike stood beside the door to room 4, carrying the aluminum case in his right hand and the intact, clear-sealed plastic bag in his left, with both red-capped tubes plainly visible inside. The timestamp embedded in the image was 10:56. She placed the 2 sheets side by side on the desk, the written explanation on the left and the printed photograph on the right, circled both times, and wrote 2 words between the circles. 4 minutes. 4 minutes after the sample package was supposedly logged into storage and assigned a new code, it was still in that man's hand, 7 miles from the laboratory, with its seal intact. Gus Perrone, 66 years old, sat across from Elias's desk that afternoon and listened to everything without interrupting. Only after Dell left did he set down his coffee cup. "Do you know where this is leading?" "I do. That computer is registered to your fiancée. Her father is Rocco Ravello. For 18 years, our 2 families have stood together in 4 harbor contracts and 1 joint fund in which all 4 families hold a stake. If you go after her, this won't be a family matter anymore. It'll be a matter between 2 houses. He'll consider it a declaration of war." Elias didn't lift his eyes from the sheet of paper marked with the 2 circles. Then they declared it first. At 6:15 on Tuesday evening, Elias Corvino arrived at St. Bridget Cancer Institute and didn't go inside. He stood at the far end of the oncology corridor, beside the vending machine and 2 rows of plastic waiting chairs, and looked down the hallway toward the rooms beyond. Marin was receiving an infusion in room 4, 2 doors away. He had asked the nurse on duty and knew she was there. Nell wasn't in the room with her mother. She was sitting in the waiting area beside an elderly woman with silver hair and a gray sweater, and across their laps lay a page crowded with words. The elderly woman spoke little English and had a Cantonese accent, and she kept shaking her head. Nell didn't read the page for her. She turned it over, tore a sheet from her black notebook, and began to write. Elias stood about 15 meters away and couldn't hear clearly, but he watched her write one line at a time and point to each line as she spoke. She wrote 4 sentences and numbered them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then she handed the page to the elderly woman and told her to take it inside and ask the doctor those questions. The woman asked her something in return, and Nell shook her head. Elias heard exactly 1 sentence, because the corridor had fallen quiet at that moment. "I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm only helping you ask." The elderly woman opened her purse. Nell gently pushed it closed and shook her head again. Elias Corvino remained at the end of the corridor for another 4 minutes. For 20 years, he had built a corporation around one principle, and he had repeated it in every boardroom so often that his employees could imitate his very cadence. No number was to be trusted if it had passed through only one pair of eyes. Every harbor contract had to undergo 3 layers of cross-checking conducted by 3 departments whose people didn't know one another. Every contractor had to appear on the approved list, and that list had to be reviewed by a 4-person committee, none of whose members could be related to the successful bidder. He had once fired a project director simply because the man had accepted a price quotation from his brother-in-law's company without disclosing the relationship. Yet when the matter became his own, he had accepted a sheet of paper from a laboratory that wasn't on the list, recommended by his fiancée, whose old friend ran it, and he had read that sheet exactly twice, folded it into quarters, and carried it to the foot of a hospital bed to read it aloud to a woman who weighed 47 kilograms. No one in his building would have dared say that to him. He arrived at the thought himself, alone, standing beside a vending machine, while the girl sitting 15 meters away had no idea he was there. The row of storage boxes from 2007 arrived on the 40th floor on Wednesday morning. 11 strapped cardboard boxes covered in a layer of warehouse dust. Del Novak opened each one on the conference room floor, and she didn't open them in numerical order, but in the order she needed. The 4th box contained Atomy Project's incoming correspondence ledger, a handwritten volume with a moss-green hardcover. She turned to June and immediately found the first entry. The 11th handwritten letter, sender M. Callahan, signed for by C. Ravello. In July, on the 29th, the same sender, the same signature. In September, on the 18th, the same sender, the same signature, and in the margin of the page, written at an angle in the same hand as that signature, were 6 words. Send it back. Don't tell E. Del photographed the page 3 times from 3 different angles before closing the ledger. That afternoon, Elias Corvino went down to St. Brigid Cancer Institute for the 2nd time that week, and this time, he went inside. Marin didn't make him leave. She told him to sit down, and there was a chair available because Nell was working the afternoon shift, and the man's wool coat was no longer draped over its back. From the drawer of the bedside table, she took out a cloudy plastic envelope containing a printed sheet of paper whose edges had grown brittle. "I've kept this for 18 years. If you want to see it, you can, but I won't give the original to anyone." It was a printout from an email inbox at an internet cafe on Smith Street, printed in August of 2007, back when places like that still printed the entire header, including the server address and the full timestamp, because people hadn't yet thought about needing to hide such things. The message had come from Elias Corvino's personal email address. It contained 4 lines. "There's nothing left to discuss. I'm getting married. Don't contact me or my office again. The child you're carrying isn't my concern." In the upper right corner of the printed page was the timestamp. 9:14 in the evening, August 3rd, 2007. Elias stared at that line for a long time. "On the night of August 3rd, 2007, he said, I was being held at the Federal Detention Center on Park Row. I went in at 4 in the afternoon and was released at 10 the next morning. My phone and wallet were locked in the safe at the Van Brunt Street office because my attorney told me not to bring anything with me. Exactly 2 people knew the code to that safe. I was one of them." Marin didn't ask who the other person was. She simply folded the sheet and slipped it back into the plastic envelope. "I sent this to 3 newspapers in 2008, she said. None of them published it. One newsroom called me back and asked whether I had any evidence proving where you were that night. I told them I didn't. How could I possibly have had it? Dell arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, carrying a tablet and a craft paper envelope. Inside the envelope were 2 prints of the same photograph. Elias had seen the first version once in his life, 18 years earlier, in a diner in Carroll Gardens, when his father pushed it across the table and told him that he ought to know what he was planning to bring home as his wife. In that version, 20-year-old Maren Callahan stood outside the entrance to a bar, with both arms around a man, her face pressed against his shoulder while he held her hand. The second version was the original, uncropped photograph, printed from the film Dell had purchased from the archive of a retired photographer in Bay Ridge. The original frame was 3 times wider. To the right of the 2 of them stood 3 other people in a line, including an older woman wiping her eyes with a tissue. A black mourning band was wrapped around the man's sleeve. In his other hand, he held an unopened condolence card. Behind them, on the bar's glass door, a chalkboard sign stated that the establishment was reserved for a private gathering that afternoon. June 17th, 2007. "This is Peter Callahan," Dell said, Mrs. Maren's older brother. That was the day of their mother's funeral. He died in 2022, after an illness no one discovered in time. The last thing Dell did was turn on the tablet. On the screen was a 57-year-old man, sitting on a bed in a nursing facility on Staten Island, breathing through a tube, with his own attorney seated beside him, and a second attorney present as a witness. Bruno Ricci spoke slowly, and had to pause between sentences. He testified that in September of 2007, someone had called him and told him to wait at the Carroll Street end of the bridge, that a girl would pass that way in the afternoon, and that all he had to do was say one sentence to her without laying a hand on her. He was asked what the sentence had been. Bruno Ricci repeated it word for word. "The young master said that if you're seen in this neighborhood again, there won't be anyone left who remembers you were ever here." He was asked who had called him. He answered that it hadn't been the young master, that the young master had never called men like him directly, and that the caller had been the young secretary who used to follow behind him carrying a notebook, the girl from the Ravello family. Dell turned off the screen. No one in the hospital room spoke for a long while. Then Elias Corvino stood, and what he said wasn't what Maren had expected, nor was it what anyone else in the room had expected. "I believed her because believing her was more convenient." This time, Judith Ansell put the procedure in writing before anyone touched anything. 4 pages, 19 steps, and the first step concerned the location. The procedure room at St. Brigid Cancer Institute. Not a patient's room, not a private residence, not an office. The second step listed those permitted to be present. Dr. Samuel Reyes as medical supervisor, Judith Ansell as legal witness, Del Novak as the official recorder, 1 technician employed by the hospital itself, and the 2 people providing the samples. No one else would be allowed inside. Judith read the list aloud before they began, including the final line. If anyone whose name didn't appear on the list entered the room, the entire procedure would stop and be repeated from the beginning on another day. At 2:25 on Friday afternoon, Elias's and Nell's identification documents were placed side by side on the table and photographed in the same frame as their faces, with the time recorded. 4 tubes were prepared instead of 2, because this time they were collecting 2 complete sets. The labels were printed by the hospital's barcode printer, each bearing a number sequence and a matching barcode, and they were applied by machine rather than by hand. The technician collected the samples and read each number sequence aloud. Dell entered it into the official record. Judith took photographs, and Nell took photographs with her own phone, the one with the cracked screen. After the 4 tubes had been placed into 2 separate sealed bags, no one applied the seals first and signed afterward. 2 pens were brought out, and Elias signed across the sealed edge of both bags. Nell then signed over his signature, and Reyes added a 3rd signature beneath theirs. All 3 signatures crossed the sealed line in 3 different directions, and Judith photographed the front, the back, and a close view of the place where the 3 sets of ink strokes overlapped. "If anyone opens this and tries to seal it again," Dell said, "they'll have to reproduce 3 signatures in the correct overlapping order on a layer of adhesive that has already been disturbed. No one's ever managed to do that without leaving a trace." The first bag was handed to a courier service with full journey tracking and sent to a forensic testing laboratory in Pennsylvania. The second was sent on an evening flight to another laboratory in Minnesota. The 2 facilities had no common ownership, held no contracts with the Corvino Corporation, appeared on none of the lists Celeste Ravello had ever approved, and both received the orders under the name of Ansell's law office rather than the Corvino name. Before signing the shipping order, Reyes asked for one additional item. I want HLA testing done for both of them as well, he said. At the same time, using the same samples, so we won't have to collect them again. I need Miss Callahan's results because I need the patient's daughter's markers. As for you, I might as well test yours too. Wherever there might be useful data, I collect it. That's a professional habit of mine. It'll cost another $300 and won't add a single day. No one questioned him. Judith added another line to the official record. Dell marked it in the margin, and that line remained undisturbed on the third page of the file for the next 3 weeks without anyone reading it again. At 4:10, everyone left the procedure room. Nell stood in the corridor, sorting the photographs on her phone. Elias stood 2 steps away from her, and he offered no preface before saying exactly what he had come to say. I was wrong in 3 places. She looked up. First, I accepted a laboratory that wasn't on the approved list, recommended by someone with a personal connection to the matter. If a project director in my company did the same thing, I'd dismiss them before the afternoon was over. Second, I left the room for 90 seconds, and didn't inspect the sample package again when I returned. Third, I accepted a sheet of paper that had passed through only one pair of eyes, and I carried it to the foot of your mother's bed. He said nothing about having been deceived. He didn't mention Celeste's name. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I'm only telling you exactly where I went wrong, so that if I make the same mistake again, you'll have something to compare it against. Nell slipped the phone into her coat pocket. She looked at him exactly as she had on Tuesday morning, in the Maspeth warehouse parking lot, without hatred, but without softening. Can you put those 3 things in writing? Yes, then I'll keep a copy. She pulled the strap of her backpack over her shoulder. An apology can't command trust, sir. It's only words. And you gave me words last week in that parking lot, then said the opposite this week. Let the evidence come first. 2 laboratories, 2 states. When both of them say the same thing, then I'll discuss what I think of you. At 10:40 on Monday morning, Nell Callahan walked into the lobby of Vireo Tower for the 2nd time in her life, and this time she had come because of a document, not because of anyone. In her hand was a formal request requiring Ashgrove Genomics to provide the complete chain of custody record for the samples, drafted by Ansell's law office, 3 pages long, and because the entity that had ordered the testing under the contract was the Corvino Corporation rather than Nell herself, the request had to be submitted to the corporation's administrative department for forwarding. Judith had told her to send it by email because it would be faster. Nell said no. She did everything on paper, with someone's signature confirming receipt and the time recorded, because over the past 3 years, she had learned that people could claim they hadn't seen an email, but they couldn't say the same about a sheet of paper bearing a signature of receipt. She didn't go up to the 40th floor. She didn't ask for anyone. She went to the reception desk, handed over 2 copies, asked them to stamp her copy as received, waited 4 minutes, took back the copy bearing a signature and date stamp, folded it in half, slipped it into the outer compartment of her backpack, and turned toward the door. At 10:51, she walked down the steps onto the Water Street sidewalk. 2 men in dark coats were waiting at the foot of the steps, and one of them called her name. What happened next was later reconstructed from the statements of 7 passers-by, and although all 7 remembered different things, they remembered one detail exactly the same way. The girl didn't run. One person said she stood perfectly still, as though she had known it was coming. The men ordered her to open her backpack. She asked who they were, and whether they had any official documentation. They showed her a report for missing property filed by the building's security department 18 minutes earlier. She set the backpack down on the steps, pulled open the zipper, and opened the middle compartment herself. Inside, beneath the black-covered notebook, lay a steel and rose-gold wristwatch with a white face, still tucked inside its velvet pouch. Nell looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she spoke 3 sentences, clearly and loudly enough for all 7 witnesses to hear. This isn't mine. I haven't opened that compartment since I entered the building. I'm requesting access to the ground floor hallway footage from 10:40 to 10:51. No one answered her. There was the crackle of a radio. A woman passing by let out a quiet gasp. A car door opened. No one dragged her, pulled her, or raised a voice, because this was Water Street near midday. And across the road stood a mobile coffee truck with 6 people waiting in line, 2 of whom were holding up their phones. Nell climbed into the vehicle on her own. She sat in the back seat, with both hands resting on her lap, her backpack already taken from her. The vehicle had traveled about 1 block when the man in the front passenger seat heard her speaking. He turned around and asked what she had said, but she didn't answer, and when he listened more closely, he realized that she was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Steady and very quiet, without rising or falling, without stopping. When she reached 20, she began again at 1. He asked if she was all right. She kept counting. For 3 years, she had counted that way inside her head, in the supermarket's human resources office, in an emergency room corridor at 4 o'clock in the morning, at the benefits counter, when someone told her that her file was missing, a document she had lost along with the car that had been towed away, and every time, she had counted silently. This was the first time the numbers had escaped her lips. Judith Ansell secured her release on bail after 31 hours. 31 hours, because it was Monday and the court was overwhelmed, and because the initial report classified the offense as organized theft rather than petty larceny, and the word organized made everything move 3 times more slowly. During those 31 hours, Maren Callahan lay in bed 4 of the hematology ward, and no one dared tell her where her daughter was until she asked Reyes herself, and Reyes never lied to his patients. Del Novak requested the ground floor hallway footage from Vireo Tower for the period between 10:30 and 11 o'clock. The technical department replied that the recording from that period was no longer on the server because a storage cleanup had been performed at 11:20 that same morning, and the person who carried out the operation had logged in using an administrator-level account. Del printed that line and carried it up to the 40th floor. Elias Corvino read the entire page without saying a word. Then he placed his right hand on the walnut desk and struck his onyx ring against the wood exactly twice. The room was behind a coffee shop on 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst, and it had only one entrance, 1 long table, 12 wooden chairs, and a wall where last year's calendar still hung because no one had bothered to take it down. Don Arturo Benedetti, 78, sat at the head of the table. Rocco Ravello sat to his left. The representatives of the other 2 families sat to his right. Elias Corvino sat at the opposite end. No one was permitted to stand behind anyone else. That was the rule of the room, and it was also why Del Novak, Judith Ansell, and Nell Callahan had to sit in 3 chairs placed against the wall behind Elias, 5 feet from the table. Don Arturo opened with exactly 1 sentence. Someone says money belonging to all 4 families was taken. Speak. Celeste Ravello rose. She wore dark clothing and no jewelry except an emerald ring, and throughout the 7 minutes she spoke, she didn't look at Elias even once. She said that for 18 years, she had occupied the finance chair at Corvino Group and had never allowed a single line to fall out of balance. She said that 5 weeks earlier, a girl had arrived in the lobby of Vireo Tower carrying a letter and an old photograph, and since that day, the man sitting at the opposite end of the table had canceled 4 meetings, halted a deal involving Pier 7, and transferred $8.4 million out of the joint fund to pay for hospital care, housing, attorneys, and bail for an outsider. She placed a file containing signed approvals on the table. She said she had remained silent until the figure exceeded what she could remain silent about. She said she was speaking today not to oppose her fiancé, but to save him from something he could no longer see clearly. Rocco Ravello didn't look at his daughter. He stared down at the tabletop. Don Arturo turned to Elias. What do you have to say? I'll let my investigator present it. She has documents. I have only words. Del Novak stood, walked to the head of the table, and set down a thick case file without offering a single word of introduction. She simply stated what the first item was, placed the document on the table, and moved to the next. Item 1. Statements from Elias Corvino's personal account, covering the past 5 weeks. 17 transactions, matching down to the last cent, with 17 invoices from St. Bridget Cancer Institute, the Service Department Company, and Ansell's Law Office. Item 2. Statements from the joint fund for the same period, showing no withdrawals other than 3 recurring payments approved by all 4 families in January. Item 3. The $8.4 million approval file misses. Ravello had just placed on the table, whose original file had been created on a laptop at 2:11 on Tuesday morning of the previous week, with the device name recorded in the metadata identifying it as the Chief Financial Officer's second device. Item 4. The test results file sent to the newspaper's newsroom, exported from that same device at 3:22 on Friday afternoon, 9 minutes before the official version reached Mr. Corvino's inbox. Item 5. The 2 sample tubes labeled in the hospital room with the codes A2214 and A2215, while the returned report listed the man's code as A2251. Item 6. Ashgrove Genomics written explanation stating that the code had been converted at 10:52 on Wednesday morning in the receiving area, and this photograph, timestamped 10:56, showing Mr. Warren Pike holding the still-sealed sample package in a hospital corridor 7 miles from that receiving area. Item 7. Ashgrove's system log showing that the sample storage camera stopped recording for 14 minutes, from 11:22 until 11:36, because of a maintenance request sent from Mr. Pike's own administrator account, even though no technician visited that day. Item 8. An order transferring $214,000 from Mrs. Ravello's personal account to a company registered in Delaware at 11:44 that same morning, whose representative was an old school friend of Mr. Pike, and whose payment description read Strategic Data Review. Item 9. Dell placed a black graph paper notebook on the table, its spine held together with tape, already open to page 29. 2 sequences of numbers were written there in blue ink, and beneath them appeared Warren Pike's signature and the date, written in his own hand in the hospital room, before 4 witnesses. Someone in the room shifted a chair. Item 10. Warren Pike's signed confession. Del Novak didn't just ask for it. 2 of Corvino's enforcers had paid Mr. Pike a quiet midnight visit at his private residence. By daylight, shivering in a cold sweat with the cold reality of what Corvino does to traitors, Pike placed his wet signature on a full confession, detailing how Celeste Ravello paid him to switch the tubes. Item 11. A Demi-Project's incoming correspondence ledger from 2007, containing 3 entries, naming M. Callahan as the sender, 3 receipt signatures bearing the name C. Ravello, and 6 handwritten words in the margin of the September page. Return it. Don't tell E. Item 12. Dell placed a second ledger on the table, this one with a gray cover, recovered from the same row of storage boxes from that year, exactly 2 boxes away from the incoming correspondence ledger. It was the reconciliation ledger for the 4-family fund, covering the period from 2006 through 2009. She said nothing more about it. She merely opened it to one particular page, turned the ledger toward Don Arturo, and stepped back. Rocco Ravello looked up for the first time. For the final item, Dell placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. The footage came from the dashboard camera of a mobile coffee truck parked across the street from Vireo Tower. The angle was wide, the image slightly blurred, and the sound of a coffee grinder could be heard in the background. On the screen, the timestamp advanced to 10:44 on Monday morning. A woman in a light-colored coat emerged from a side entrance of the building, walked toward a man standing beside a lamppost, handed him a small bag, spoke for about 4 seconds, and then went back inside. During those 4 seconds, the woman's right hand rested loosely in front of her stomach, and her thumb turned the ring on her ring finger once, then again, then once more. 7 minutes later, still within the same frame, an 18-year-old girl descended the steps with a backpack over her shoulder. Dell turned off the screen. No one in the room said a word. Then came a very small, very dry crack, and a piece of black plastic fell onto the wooden table, rolled twice, and came to rest. The pen in Celeste Ravello's hand had snapped in 2. Don Arturo Benedetti pushed the gray-covered ledger aside and asked whether anyone else had something to say. Nell Callahan rose from the chair against the wall. Judith reached out slightly, meaning to stop her, but Nell had already stepped forward and taken her place beside the head of the table, her hands hanging at her sides, holding no papers at all. "I'm not asking anyone here for anything," she said. "I only want to ask her one question in front of everyone, so I won't have to spend the rest of my life asking myself." She turned toward Celeste. "The 3 letters from 2007, you signed for all 3. My mother was 20 years old then, pregnant, and 3 times she walked from Gowanus to Van Brunt Street to leave those letters because she couldn't afford registered mail. I'm not asking why you intercepted them. I'm asking this. After you signed for the 3rd letter and wrote those 6 words in the margin of the ledger, did you go home, eat your dinner, and sleep?" Celeste Ravello raised her head. What happened next silenced the entire room, because she didn't deny it, didn't cry, didn't plead. She answered, "I slept." She stood, planting both hands on the table. "You're 18 and I was already sitting at this table, little girl. In 2007, I was 23. My father sent me to work as his secretary the way a man sends collateral from one family to another, and I sat in rooms without electricity. I collected money in places even men didn't want to enter. 3 times, I took the blame when the books didn't balance. 18 years. For 18 years, I waited for a wedding that never came. And every year, he found another reason. And I still remained because I believed the one who stayed the longest was the one who earned the right to belong. But all your mother had to do was fall ill once, and she got an entire family. She turned toward Elias, and her voice broke on the final word. Only that one word. Tell me where I was wrong. Elias Corvino rose. He didn't look at her. He looked at Don Arturo. Before you decide, I'll speak for my part in this. He placed both hands on the table. She fabricated evidence. Everything proving that is already on the table, and I have nothing to add. But 18 years ago, I was the one who looked at a cropped photograph and didn't ask a single question. I was the one who turned off my phone. I was the one who had 3 letters recorded in the incoming correspondence ledger of my own company, and never once asked what else was written in that ledger. And last week, I was still the man who took a sheet of paper that had passed through only one pair of eyes, stood at the foot of a patient's bed, and read it aloud. No one held my mouth shut. She set the trap, but I walked into it myself, twice, 18 years apart. He sat down. Rocco Ravello rose. At 74, he stood slowly, both hands gripping the edge of the table, and he didn't look toward his daughter even once. My family didn't stand behind this, he told Don Arturo. My family doesn't stand behind the person who did it either. As of today, that name no longer appears in anything belonging to my family. Deal with her however you choose. Celeste wheeled toward her father and called his name once. He had already sat down and didn't turn around. Elias Corvino rose slowly. He didn't look at Celeste. His shadow stretched long and dark across the walnut table as he placed his right hand flat upon the gray ledger. I don't call federal prosecutors to settle blood debts, Celeste. The underworld doesn't run on court summons. His voice dropped into a register so low and chilling that even Don Arturo shifted in his seat. By sunrise, every offshore account under your name in Geneva and the Caymans is frozen. Your shares in Corvino Group, your authority at Pier 7, and every piece of property purchased with my family's money are seized under the blood treason clause. Celeste's hands began to tremble against the wood. Elias, 18 years. 18 years of feeding off my house while trying to erase my bloodline. Elias cut her off, his pale gray eyes fixed on her like cold stone. You walked into this room believing you were a master strategist. You leave it as a ghost. If you are ever seen within 50 miles of Brooklyn, or if your shadow so much as falls across my daughter ever again, there won't even be a body left for your father to bury. He struck his onyx ring against the tabletop hard, twice. The sound echoed through the silent room like a death knell. Get her out of my sight. Danny Kovac stepped forward, his eyes cold and unblinking, and ripped the heavy door open. Celeste picked up her bag with shaking hands, her mask of elegance completely shattered, and fled into the hallway. The sound of her heels traveled through the coffee shop's outer room, past tables where people sat drinking without looking up, then out onto the sidewalk, growing fainter until it could no longer be heard. In the room behind the shop, no one said anything more. Nell Callahan remained exactly where she had been standing, and she was the only person who watched until the door closed. The 2 results from 2 different states arrived 4 hours apart on Thursday morning, one from Pennsylvania and one from Minnesota, and both said the same thing. The probability of biological relationship was greater than 99.99%. Nell read the first report in the hospital corridor, folded it, slipped it into her backpack, and went to work her afternoon shift. She read the second at 11 o'clock that night, beneath the warehouse lights in Maspeth during her 15-minute break. She didn't call anyone. A victory didn't save anybody. On Friday morning, Marin Callahan walked from the ward doors to the front steps to wait for the car, taking her back to the temporary shelter. And on the second step, her legs gave way. She didn't fall hard. She merely slid down against the edge of the step and landed heavily. And when Nell ran to her, Marin was still conscious, still able to say 3 words. Don't make noise, Reyes admitted her immediately. Her red blood cell count had fallen. Her blood pressure was low, and the new scans showed signs that the disease hadn't fully receded after induction therapy. He didn't speak in circles. He said it was time to consider a transplant, and sooner than they had planned. That afternoon, he carried the 2 HLA reports into her room, sat down, and spread them across the blanket. Miss Callahan is a half match for her mother, he said. In simple terms, half of your markers are identical to your mother's because you inherited that half from her. This is a type of transplant we perform frequently, a child donating to a parent, and for a patient without biological siblings, this is nearly the best opportunity we have. Elias asked what about him. Reyes folded the second report. You aren't a match, and I could have predicted that without waiting for the results, sir. Biological relationship here means a biological relationship to the patient, and my patient is Mrs. Marin Callahan. You're the father of her daughter, but to Marin herself, you're a complete stranger. Your markers, compared with hers, are no different from those of any person walking in off the street right now. No amount of money can change your place in that equation. Elias said nothing. He sat perfectly still with both hands resting on his knees, and he remained in that position for the rest of the conversation. Nell had already risen halfway through the sentence. Then do it. Where are the papers? I'll sign them. I'm 18. I can sign for myself. I don't need anyone else's permission. I know you're old enough. Then give me the papers. Reyes didn't give them to her. He pulled Nell's own blood test from the file, the one he had ordered 2 days earlier without telling anyone, and placed it on the blanket beside the other 2 reports. You weigh 49 kilograms. Your hemoglobin is 9.2. Your ferritin is nearly at rock bottom. You have chronic iron deficiency anemia, and you've had it for at least 2 years, possibly 3, because you haven't eaten enough or slept enough for a very long time. Did you know that? She said nothing. You didn't know because you've never gone to a doctor for yourself. You go to doctors for your mother. Reyes removed his glasses. Now I'm going to make this clear, and I'm only going to say it once. If I administer marrow-stimulating medication to a body in your present condition, I'll collect fewer cells than we need, and if we collect fewer than we need, the transplant could fail. Then I could lose both mother and daughter instead of one. You're old enough to consent. Your body isn't strong enough to donate. Those are 2 different things, and I won't confuse them just to make you feel better. Then how long? 3 weeks. Intravenous iron infusions. The diet I prescribe. At least 7 hours of sleep every night, and no more night shifts at the warehouse. During those 3 weeks, your mother will remain on maintenance treatment. I'm not letting her slip away. If you can do that, I'll perform the procedure. If you can't, I won't. Nell began to cry. Not loudly. She simply stood there with both hands still hanging at her sides, tears running down her face without a sound, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand once, then stopped wiping them altogether. It was the first time in this entire story that she had cried, and she wasn't crying because she had been refused. She was crying because, in the previous 30 seconds, a stranger had looked at a sheet of paper and told her that she was sick too. Those 3 weeks passed in a way she had never lived before. Someone called to remind her to eat. Someone drove her to her iron infusions on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. She slept 9 hours a night, and during the first week, she could barely wake up because her body was reclaiming everything that had been borrowed from it over the past 3 years. By the 3rd week, her hemoglobin had risen to 11.8. Reyes looked at the number, nodded, and scheduled the procedure. On the morning of the transplant, Elias Corvino sat in a row of plastic chairs outside the 4th floor corridor. He had canceled 2 meetings, 3 calls, and 1 flight. He had nothing to do. There was no one to command. There were no contracts to sign, no documents to fold, no laboratories to choose, no one to pay. In 20 years, this was the first morning he had ever sat inside a building where he couldn't buy a single minute of time. His hands rested on his knees. The thumb of his right hand turned the onyx ring once, stopped, then turned it again. Nell emerged from the changing room wearing a blue paper gown, plastic slippers on her feet, and her hair tucked beneath a cloth cap. She walked over to him and crouched until her eyes were level with his, then took his right hand and pulled it away from the ring. "You're turning that ring," she said. "You have been this whole time." He couldn't answer. "Listen, in a little while, they'll call my name and I'll go inside, and you'll sit here. I know you're not used to sitting still, so I'm going to teach you something. I do this whenever I'm afraid." She held his hand between both of hers. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted slowly, evenly, and very softly, in the same voice she had used while counting in the back seat of the car the previous Monday, with only one difference. When you reach 20, go back to 1. Just keep doing that. It won't make the fear disappear, but it'll make the time pass." Then she stood, released his hand, and walked inside. The door closed behind her. Elias Corvino remained alone in that row of plastic chairs. And a little while later, a passing nurse heard the man in the three-piece suit counting very softly. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 14th day after the transplant, Maren Callahan couldn't keep down anything but water. And Dr. Reyes sat at the head of her bed exactly 4 times that day. On the 30th day, the new marrow began to engraft, and he said only 3 words to mother and daughter. "It is working." On the 100th day, when every number had returned to where it belonged, and the scans no longer showed any trace of the disease, he still wouldn't allow anyone in the room to use the word cured. He said she was recovering, then added that recovering was a very good word. People simply didn't like it because it came without applause. The following February, Nell Callahan took her high school equivalency exam at a testing center on Court Street, sharing the room with 2 middle-aged men and a pregnant woman, and she passed on her first attempt. In September, she enrolled in the nursing program at a community college in Brooklyn, 3 years behind others her age. On the first morning of school, she wore a new coat, and the first thing she noticed when she put it on wasn't its color or its price. It was the zipper, a zipper that closed all the way to her throat without needing a single safety pin. Inside her backpack, pressed flat within a rigid plastic sleeve, were the 2 halves of the letter, joined again with archival tape. The first time the word "Dad" slipped from her lips was on a November afternoon in the hospital parking lot. She had walked halfway to the entrance when she remembered that she'd left her notebook on the back seat. She turned around, tapped on the window, and said, "Dad, can you get my notebook for me?" They both froze. He held the notebook in his hand and didn't give it to her right away. She looked down at the pavement. Then she took it, said thank you, and went inside. Neither of them ever mentioned it again, but throughout the entire drive home, he didn't turn on the music even once. Her tuition money was placed in a trust jointly administered by Ansell's law office and an independent trustee, and its governing terms included a provision Elias Corvino himself had insisted upon. The donor had no right to reclaim the funds, no right to alter the conditions, and no right to terminate the trust for any reason connected to the personal relationship between the 2 parties. When Nell asked why the language had to be so strict, he told her it was because love must never become something she could keep only by being obedient. 1 year later, a table, 2 chairs, a locking file cabinet, and a small sign bearing 3 words, "The Open Door," appeared in the left corner of the main lobby at St. Bridget Cancer Institute. There, people helped patients understand referral forms, consent documents, and test results. They helped them write down the questions they needed to ask their doctors, replace lost identification papers, and preserve custody of their children while undergoing treatment. No one was filmed. No one had to recount the circumstances of their life before a camera in exchange for help. On the wall behind that table, displayed inside a glass frame, were the 2 halves of the letter joined back together, with the tear running across the middle of the page still clearly visible. Beneath the frame was a handwritten line. "Not every tear has to be hidden after it is mended. Some scars are directions." The year-end fundraiser was held in that same lobby. There was no stage and no red carpet, only several rows of folding chairs and an old piano borrowed from the church next door, missing 2 keys in the middle register. Maren Callahan sat down before that piano. Her hair had begun growing back around her temples. She was still thin, and her fingertips remained numb from the treatments, so she had to spread her hands wide and close them twice before placing them on the keys. Nell stood behind her mother. She bent down, leaned close to her ear, and counted very softly. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the 3rd and final time anyone ever heard her count aloud, and this time it wasn't because she was afraid. Maren began to play the piece she had practiced in the church 18 years earlier on evenings when no one else was there. The same piece her daughter had played over and over every morning at the subway station for 3 years, in exchange for loose change, dropped into a paper cup. She played much more slowly than she had long ago. At the 9th measure, she struck the wrong note, the very note her daughter always missed, then paused for half a beat, and continued as though nothing had happened. At the back of the room, against the wall, a man stood leaning there without a suit, without anyone beside him, both hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't step forward. He didn't let anyone know he was there. He simply remained until the music ended, and when everyone applauded, he applauded too, about 1 beat later than the others. The cruelest thing in this entire story Wasn't the test result switched during a 14-minute power outage, nor was it the letters intercepted for 18 years. The cruelest thing was how quickly a scrap of paper could erase the humanity of people who already had nothing left to lose, and how quickly everyone around them accepted it, simply because that paper had been printed by a place that looked trustworthy. Evidence matters, but the process that protects evidence matters even more. A result can be trusted only when the path it traveled can be trusted too. And human dignity has never been a favor bestowed by the powerful upon the weak. It was already present in the room before money, illness, clothing, or bloodlines ever entered. If this story touched something within you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with anyone you believe needs to hear it, so that every day you'll have more meaningful stories to listen to. How do you feel about the story of Nell, Marin, and Elias? What would you do if you found yourself in their circumstances? And was there anything in this story that reminded you of someone in your own life? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video. This story is entirely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes and to convey positive messages about compassion and human dignity. Every character, organization, and event in this story is fictional, and any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.